For months, I had noticed the small changes. It started innocently enough. At first, I brushed them off, chalked it up to stress, long hours at work, maybe even the everyday grind of life. But over time, these changes started piling up, and I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. My wife, Sarah, had become distant, and not in the way you think when someone is tired or overwhelmed. It wasn't just that she was busy or stressed. Those are things we all go through. No, it was something deeper, something that made me feel like I was losing her without even realizing it. It started with the small stuff, little things like how she used to leave her phone out in plain sight, always available for me to see. But now it was always face down when she wasn't using it, like she was guarding it from me. It wasn't subtle. I noticed the way she would check her phone constantly when I wasn't around, then quickly hide it or lock it when I came close. The smile she'd give me, was it a real one? Or just a habit? But it didn't stop there. Then there were the late nights. She always worked hard, and I respected that about her. She was ambitious, driven. But over the last few months, her late nights at work were happening more and more often. At first, I accepted it. She's climbing the corporate ladder, I thought. But then the hours started to get longer, the excuses started to feel thinner. She'd say she was just finishing up a report or having a meeting with a colleague, but the next day when I asked about it, it was always the same response. I was just really tired, nothing to worry about. But the more I pushed her, the more distant she became. I'd ask her about the long hours or what she was working on, and she'd brush me off with a light laugh, a simple, "You're overthinking it." I was overthinking it, right? That's what she said after all. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she would wave it off so casually, that made me feel like I was being kept at arm's length. That wasn't like Sarah. We used to share everything, our days, our thoughts, our frustrations. But now, she seemed detached, almost like I was no longer part of her life in the same way I used to be. And the worst part? I started to doubt myself. Was I paranoid? Was I just imagining things? Maybe I had been neglecting her. Maybe I was the one pulling away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. Something was off. I could feel it in the air when she came home late, in the way she would change the subject when I tried to talk to her, in the way she no longer seemed to want to spend time with me. Then there were the other little things, the ones that were hard to explain but impossible to ignore. Like how, when she came home, she'd smell different. Not like perfume, not like a new shampoo, just different. I couldn't place it, but it wasn't the scent I remembered from before. And how she'd act so careful when we went out together, making sure she was always a step ahead of me, always keeping a little distance between us in public. Like she didn't want to be seen with me the way she used to be. But the clincher, the moment I knew that something was definitely wrong, happened one evening when I tried to surprise her with a nice dinner after work. I came home early, ready to do something special, but when I opened the door to our bedroom, I found her texting someone quickly and nervously like she didn't want me to see. The second I stepped into the room, she quickly shoved the phone under the pillow. She laughed, almost too loud. "You startled me, that's all." I didn't believe her. I knew that laugh. It was forced, unnatural. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to make sense of everything I had seen. I asked her who she had been texting, and she froze, just for a moment, too long. Just work stuff? I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like I was losing her. It was almost as if she had already checked out of our marriage, like she had already moved on in some small way and hadn't told me yet. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to admit that my wife was becoming a stranger. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't sit in the dark, constantly doubting myself. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for her to come clean. I was going to take matters into my own hands. I had to know who she was really spending her time with. One night, after yet another late meeting, Sarah came home unusually late. The moment I heard the front door creak open, I knew something was different. She didn't greet me like she usually did. No kiss, no smile, no genuine warmth. Instead, she walked in quietly, like she was trying not to make a sound, almost like she was hoping I wouldn't notice her return. She was always so energetic when she came home, eager to tell me about her day or joke about something small. But tonight was different. She seemed off. She didn't even take off her jacket before heading straight into the kitchen. The whole atmosphere felt heavy, as though a silent wall had risen between us. I watched her from the couch, but I didn't say anything. I could feel it, the growing distance between us, the way her every move seemed rehearsed, like she was playing a part. My gut twisted, that familiar feeling of unease washing over me. I'd seen her like this before, distant, detached, like she was living in a different world. But tonight, it felt final. I didn't want to admit it, but my mind couldn't help but replay all the little signs I had ignored. The late nights, the quiet phone calls, the way she always locked her phone when I walked into the room. It all started to make sense. Something was off. I couldn't just sit there anymore, pretending I didn't know what was happening. I had to know for sure. The doubt that had been creeping into my mind for months now had reached a tipping point. I knew it was time. That night, I made a decision, one that I knew would change everything. I had never done anything like this before, but I was desperate for answers. I decided to stay awake. I waited for her to head to bed, and when she finally did, I pretended to sleep, letting my eyes close just enough for her to think I was out. But inside, my mind was on high alert. My heart raced as I listened to the sounds of her movement in the room. The soft rustle of sheets, the quiet click of the lamp being turned off. I could hear the soft cadence of her breathing, but I knew she was wide awake, thinking I was asleep, none the wiser. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. My mind raced with the weight of what I was about to do, knowing that once I made my move, there would be no going back. I was about to pull the curtain back on the life I thought I knew, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find. The stillness in the room was deafening. I could hear her breathing next to me, but something felt wrong. A slight rustle, a soft sound, her phone vibrating on the nightstand. I hadn't heard it before. Why would she leave her phone on the nightstand if she knew I'd be close? It was one of the things she used to do. Always keep her phone within arm's reach, but never leave it in plain sight. Something was different. I waited for the sound to fade, hoping that this was just my imagination, but then I heard her softly picking up the phone. It was quiet, too quiet, like she was trying not to wake me. She was texting. She was texting someone. I could almost feel the tension in the air, the sense that something important was happening, something she didn't want me to know. At that moment, the truth hit me harder than I ever expected. I knew she was hiding something. I didn't need to hear the conversation. I didn't need to see who she was talking to. The fact that she thought I wouldn't notice the phone vibrating, the fact that she was trying to be so secretive, said it all. I didn't move. I kept my breathing steady, my eyes closed, pretending to sleep, while my mind raced with 100 different questions. Who was she talking to? Why was she acting like this? As she set the phone down, I waited. I had to be patient. I had to wait for the moment when I could get up, confront her, and find out the truth. The truth I had been dreading to face. I wanted to confront her then, but I knew I had to be smart. I couldn't let her know I was onto her just yet. Minutes turned into hours as I lay there, still pretending to be asleep. The house was eerily quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The longer I stayed there, the more I realized I was terrified of what I was about to find out. But one thing was for sure, I couldn't keep ignoring this feeling. I needed answers. Finally, as the house grew quiet and the lights went off, I knew the time had come. The next move was mine. Would I stay quiet, pretending like I didn't know? Or would I confront Sarah with everything I had learned? I had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. This night, this moment would change everything. I was about to walk into a reality I had been running from for too long, but I couldn't hide anymore. And when I finally faced her, when I finally said the words I had been holding back, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Hours passed in silence, but I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, my mind racing, filled with thoughts and questions that wouldn't let go. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every small noise, every creak in the house seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, and I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't control. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of the trees outside, the sound of distant cars passing, it all became background noise as I focused on what I had to do next. But then, something broke the silence. At around 1 a.m., I heard it, the faintest sound, barely noticeable at first, but enough to make my heart stop. The back door creaked open. It wasn't the usual sound of someone coming in and out, but the kind of sound that was too quiet, too careful, like someone didn't want to be heard. I froze. My body tensed, and for a split second I thought I was imagining it. But then, I heard it again, a soft, barely audible scrape of metal against metal, followed by a faint click. It was unmistakable. The back door was opening. My heart jumped into my throat, and adrenaline shot through my body. I had been waiting for this moment, the moment when I would finally find out the truth. But now, as the sound of the door creaked open, a cold chill ran down my spine. Who was it? It couldn't have been Sarah. She had locked the door before going to bed, just like she always did. I remembered her locking it with a quick twist of the key before slipping into bed beside me. But now, someone else was slipping into our home in the dead of night, and my mind was racing with possibilities. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The house was eerily quiet, every sound amplified in the stillness. I couldn't even hear Sarah's breathing beside me. The tension in the air was thick, every second that passed dragging me deeper into the pit of anxiety growing in my stomach. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, some trick of the mind. Maybe it was just the wind or the house settling. But then there was another sound, footsteps, soft, cautious, like someone was trying to move without being heard. They were barely audible, but they were there. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Each step seemed deliberate, calculated. However, it was knew exactly where they were going, and they weren't worried about being discovered. I sat up slowly, barely able to control my breathing. I had to find out who was in the house. But I didn't want to make a sound. I couldn't make a sound. Whoever was out there, they couldn't know I was awake. If I did anything now, I might miss my chance. I had to be sure. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath again. Time seemed to stretch on. Each passing second felt like an eternity. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even blink. All I could do was listen. Then I heard it, a muffled voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone. It was too familiar. The sound of Sarah's voice. It was barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. She was talking to someone, and that someone wasn't me. My stomach dropped. I knew it. This wasn't just a late-night meeting. This wasn't just some innocent excuse. She was hiding something, or rather someone. And that someone was right here. The anger inside me started to boil, but I forced myself to stay calm, stay hidden. I needed to know what was going on, and I needed to know who she was meeting, who was so important that they could sneak into our house in the middle of the night, without so much as a second thought. The conversation grew clearer, the sound of voices cutting through the air. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized I was listening to something I shouldn't be hearing, something that was tearing apart the fabric of everything I had believed in. I gripped the edge of the bed, my knuckles white from the tension. Every fiber of my being screamed to burst out of that room and confront them right then and there, but I knew I couldn't. I needed to be sure. I needed to gather the pieces of the puzzle before I made a move. And then, just as my patience was wearing thin, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening, a door that led into our living room. The realization hit me like a freight train. Whoever was here wasn't leaving. They were staying. I knew I had to do something. The silence in the house now was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, louder than the whispers coming from the living room. But what if I was wrong? What if my suspicions were just my imagination running wild? No, I couldn't afford to be wrong. Not now. Not after everything I had already seen. And that's when I knew I had to act. I couldn't wait any longer. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I had to get up, confront them, and finally uncover the truth. But how? How would I face her? How would I handle whatever I was about to find? The storm was coming, and it was going to break everything. I held my breath as the door shut softly behind them. The sound of it closing felt like a shot to the chest, a signal that something was happening that I couldn't ignore any longer. I stayed still, barely moving, listening with every fiber of my being as the house creaked under their weight. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps moving through the hallway, careful, almost deliberate, like someone who didn't want to be heard. Every step seemed to echo louder in my mind. I had no idea who it was. Was it Sarah? Was it someone else? My heart raced as I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of their presence in the house. But the silence around me was unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very air I was breathing was thick with tension. I stayed perfectly still, watching the shadows cast across the bedroom as I waited for the next sound, the next clue. And then, as I leaned in a little closer, trying to be as quiet as possible, I heard it, a voice. At first, I couldn't make out the words. It was too soft, too far away. But then, the voice grew clearer, sharper, and the realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. It was Jason. Jason. I froze. The blood in my veins seemed to freeze with me as my heart slammed into my chest, threatening to burst out of me. It couldn't be him, but it was the same Jason who had been spending so much extra time with Sarah recently. The same one who had been showing up at all the office events. The one she had been texting late at night. The one who had always been a little too friendly for my comfort. I had brushed it off, convincing myself that I was being paranoid. After all, Jason was Sarah's coworker. He was her work friend. The guy who always gave me a polite handshake when I bumped into him at office parties. He was just a harmless friend, right? A good guy. He was probably just there to help with something related to her work. But the way he spoke now, so casually, so intimately, told me everything I needed to know. I listened intently, my mind racing to piece together the puzzle. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. The conversation wasn't about work. It wasn't about projects or meetings. It was personal, far too personal. I could hear the way Jason's voice dropped, the way Sarah responded with a laugh that wasn't like any I'd heard before. It was flirty, light, teasing, as if they were sharing something I wasn't meant to hear. It was a laugh I hadn't heard in months, the kind that used to be just for me. A sick realization spread through me like ice water. They weren't just coworkers. This wasn't just about work. This wasn't just about late meetings or extra hours. It was about something else entirely, something that had been building for a long time. I strained to hear the conversation, my mind spinning with what I was hearing. Jason's voice was low, but his words were unmistakable. He was talking to Sarah in a way no coworker should talk to a married woman. He was talking to her like they had a secret, like they were lovers. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront them, to run out of the room and demand the truth, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Not yet. I had to hear it all. I needed the truth, the unvarnished, ugly truth that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. I couldn't let them see me yet. If they knew I was awake, If they knew I knew, it would all end in excuses and lies. I had to be certain. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had believed in, everything I thought I knew about Sarah, was slipping away, piece by piece. The man I had trusted with her had just walked into my house like he belonged there, and now he was part of a story I hadn't asked to be a part of. Then, just as I was about to hear more, I heard footsteps again, this time closer. They weren't trying to hide anymore. It was like they didn't even care if I was awake, like they knew something had already been lost. They were moving through the house as if this was just another night, another meeting that I wasn't supposed to be privy to. But this wasn't just another night. This wasn't a work event. This was something that had been going on for far too long, something I had missed, no, something I hadn't wanted to see. And now it was happening right under my nose. The reality of it hit me hard. I could feel it in my bones. Sarah wasn't just spending extra time with Jason. She was spending her time with him in ways I shouldn't have to imagine. The trust one thought we had built was being torn apart. I felt the rage start to bubble up, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. I needed to stay in control. I needed to see everything. I wasn't going to let them slip away from me again. This time I would get the answers I deserved. This time, I was going to make sure that nothing would stay hidden. Every inch of my body was on edge, my muscles tight, my mind racing. Jason? What was he doing here in our house in the middle of the night? My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing in my ears. I couldn't believe what was happening. The man who had been a part of our lives for so long, who had always seemed harmless, was now standing in the very house I called home. This wasn't just a coincidence. I knew that much. The way he had entered so quietly, moving through the house like he had done this before, like he was comfortable here, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just here to talk shop. He wasn't here for some business discussion. This was personal. I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps in the hall, muffled but clear enough to make my skin crawl. It was the way they moved that made me certain of it, slow, careful, like they were trying to hide something, trying not to make a sound. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the house. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. It was as though the night had turned into a stage, and I was an unwilling spectator, waiting for the truth to unfold in front of me. I held my breath, staying as still as possible. The tension was suffocating, and I could feel my chest tightening, my pulse racing. I told myself to stay calm, to be rational, to not jump to conclusions. But every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to confront them, to end this charade. But I didn't move. Not yet. I stayed in the darkness, watching, listening. My eyes were fixed on the door, hoping for some sign, some indication of what was happening in the next room. But there was nothing. No sounds of them talking. No loud arguments. Just quiet, the kind of quiet that made my heart race even faster. The minutes dragged by, each one more agonizing than the last. My legs were starting to cramp, my body aching from the tension, but I couldn't move. I had to know exactly what was happening. This wasn't the time for impulse. I had to get the facts, and I had to get them now. Then, just as I thought I might lose my nerve, I heard something that made my stomach drop, a soft murmur from the hallway. It wasn't a full conversation, just the faintest whisper, but it was enough. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, it was intimate. Jason's voice was lower, softer than usual, as though he was trying to comfort someone, or maybe to keep something hidden. But Sarah, my wife, responded in a way I hadn't heard in months, gentle, affectionate, almost like she was responding to a lover. The words were still too faint to understand fully, but the intimacy in the exchange was unmistakable. I felt like I had just been punched in the gut. It was like the world had shifted beneath me, and I was struggling to stay on my feet. The reality was too much to process all at once, but I couldn't look away. Every part of me wanted to storm out of the room, to scream, to demand answers, but something inside me held me back. I wasn't ready to face the truth yet. Not until I knew for sure. I could feel the sweat running down my back, cold and sticky, as I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for them to make their next move. They were still moving around the house, their voices muffled, but the sound of their presence, their closeness, was enough to send my mind spiraling. What were they doing? How long had this been going on? What had Sarah been hiding from me all this time? The anger bubbled up inside me, hot and fierce, but it was tempered by something else, a cold, numbing fear. I had always thought I knew Sarah. I had trusted her, loved her, believed that we had something real. But now, everything I had taken for granted was being ripped away, piece by piece, and all I had left was a sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. I couldn't keep waiting forever. I knew that. The more I stayed in the dark, the more control I lost. The more I heard their voices, the more I knew that I needed to confront them. But then, something shifted. I heard Sarah's voice, clear now, no longer trying to hide the words. She was speaking to Jason with that same tone, the one I had heard only between the two of them. It wasn't about work. It wasn't about anything innocent. It was about them together. A cold realization washed over me. They weren't just friends. They were more than that. I had been living a lie. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard what I had just heard. But what was I supposed to do next? How would I face them? How would I even confront Sarah? Every inch of my body was screaming for answers, but I still didn't know how to get them. My mind raced through every possibility, each one more painful than the last, but I knew there was only one choice left. I had to step out of the shadows and face them. Face her, no matter what the truth would bring. And as I prepared to move, I felt that familiar surge of rage flood my veins, but this time, it wasn't about anger. It was about demanding the truth. And nothing was going to stop me from finding it. The longer I lay there, pretending to be asleep, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. It was like a switch had been flipped in my mind, and everything I had been ignoring, everything I had tried to brush off, suddenly became glaringly obvious. The details, the small things, came flooding back to me in a rush. The late nights, those long hours she kept at work that always seemed to stretch longer and longer. I remember telling myself it was just a temporary phase, that she was climbing the corporate ladder, and that I needed to be patient. But now it felt like an excuse. She didn't need to stay at work that late. She didn't need to be too tired to talk to me when she got home. The truth was staring me in the face, and I had ignored it for far too long. The hushed conversations, the whispered phone calls late at night when she thought I was already asleep, her voice muffled but still carrying that same odd tone. Too careful, too guarded. She never wanted me to know who she was talking to, never wanted to share even the smallest detail. I had assumed it was work stuff, but now I knew. It was him. It was Jason. The time she had spent with Jason outside of work. I had always brushed it off, told myself I was being overly cautious, paranoid even. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how often Jason seemed to pop up in her life. Lunches they would have together. Those impromptu meetings at the office. I'd never been suspicious before, at least not enough to act on it. But looking back, it was all there. He had been slowly taking her away from me, piece by piece. The silence in the house spoke louder than any words they could have said. It was deafening. The quiet between me and Sarah had grown so thick that it felt suffocating. I couldn't stand it anymore. The silence wasn't comforting, wasn't peaceful. It was a constant reminder of the gap that had formed between us. The gap that had started to widen the moment she had started pulling away. I could feel my pulse quickening, the adrenaline flooding my system. Every word, every interaction, every little detail was starting to make sense in a way that crushed me. It wasn't just a vague feeling in the back of my mind anymore. I knew the truth now. They weren't just coworkers. They weren't just spending time together for work. They were more than that. They were involved. I lay there in the darkness, my thoughts spiraling, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind? The realization hit me like a freight train, and for a moment I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell myself I was wrong, that I was just overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew it was all true. Sarah was cheating on me. She had been for who knows how long, and I had been too blind, too trusting, too desperate to see it. I could feel the anger rising within me, but there was something else, something darker, more painful. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the humiliation. The fact that she had been lying to my face, deceiving me, and I had trusted her, believed in her. I had thought our relationship was built on something real, something solid. But now, it felt like all of it had been a lie. I wanted to get up, confront them both, demand answers. I wanted to storm out of the room and scream at the top of my lungs. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to be sure. I needed to hear them say it. I needed to know for certain that what I was feeling wasn't some sick nightmare that I could wake up from. And so I stayed there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the faint sound of movement in the next room. I couldn't see them, couldn't hear every word, but I could feel it, the weight of their secret hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. I had to know the truth, and no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it tore me apart, I knew there was no going back now. The silence in the house had turned into a scream in my ears, a scream that drowned out every other thought. I wasn't just going to sit here in the dark, pretending everything was fine. I couldn't let Sarah think she had gotten away with it. I wasn't going to be the fool who allowed this to continue. I had waited long enough. It was time to confront her, to face the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had shared my life with, and finally ask the one question that had been burning inside me for so long. What the hell is going on? I stayed still, my body frozen in place, heart pounding as I listened to the sounds from the living room. The clock on the wall seemed to be ticking louder with each passing second, marking time I couldn't get back. The weight of the truth had settled in my chest like a brick, and every breath felt like I was suffocating. I could hear their voices faintly, Jason's low murmurs and Sarah's laughter that didn't sound like hers anymore. I wanted to get up, to storm into the living room and end this nightmare right there, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in a moment I couldn't escape. Every inch of me was screaming for action, but I couldn't act in a haze of rage. No, I needed to think clearly. I had to confront them. But how? How could I face them after everything I had just uncovered? The tension in the air was thick, and every second that ticked by only made it worse. The silence between each word they spoke was like an unbearable weight, crushing my chest even more. The longer I waited, the more I could feel the rage bubbling inside me, threatening to spill over. But what would that achieve? Would it make things clearer? Or would I lose my chance to get the truth? The frustration gnawed at me, but I had to stay in control. I couldn't let my anger take over. Not yet. It wasn't about yelling or accusing. It was about the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about the whole damn foundation of our relationship being a lie. I could feel my heart racing. The realization that the woman I trusted most in the world, the woman I married, had been deceiving me for who knows how long made my blood run cold. It wasn't just Jason. It was the deceit, the betrayal, the complete lack of respect for everything we had built together. It was the knowledge that I had been living in a false reality. They were still talking, laughing softly, the sound muffled by the walls but still unmistakable. Jason's voice dropped lower, and Sarah responded with a soft laugh that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a fling. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or a few "I'm sorries." No, this was something that had been happening for a while, and that realization stung worse than anything I had ever felt. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just wait any longer. My mind screamed for me to act, but I was frozen, unsure of how to face them, how to confront both of them. I had to do it soon. My thoughts were all over the place, but one thing was certain. I couldn't let them go on. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The anger was seething in my chest, hot and overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to gather the evidence, the truth, whatever it was they thought I didn't know. Each word they spoke felt like a dagger, a reminder of the lie they had built around me. The trust one thought we had, the respect, it all felt like it had been shattered into a million pieces. And then I heard it, a soft sound, a rustling, a movement, and then Sarah's voice, louder now, more distinct. "Jason, I'm glad you're here." Her words sent a wave of disgust through me. But it wasn't just her words. It was the tone, the familiarity in her voice. That was the moment I realized the full extent of the betrayal. They weren't just being careless. They weren't just slipping up. They were comfortable. They had been doing this for long enough that they didn't even have to hide it anymore. My hands clenched into fists, the anger in me threatening to explode. I could feel it, the rage, the hurt, the sheer disbelief, but I had to stay calm. I had to handle this with the clarity I was struggling to find. I had to confront them with the facts, not just emotions. As I finally forced myself to move, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like a sense of inevitability. I had waited long enough. I had waited for them to show their hand, and now it was time for me to step out of the shadows and make them face me. Every part of me wanted to burst out of the room and demand answers, but I knew that would only give them a chance to deny it all, to say I was overreacting, that it wasn't what it seemed. No, I needed them to admit it, to own it. The time for waiting was over. The time for confrontation had come. With a deep breath, I slowly walked towards the door, knowing this would be the moment everything changed. No more lies. No more secrets. They were going to face the truth, whether they wanted to or not. I wasn't going to let them continue this charade any longer. A few more minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The silence between the muffled voices in the living room seemed to stretch out endlessly. I could barely make out the words, but I didn't need to hear them clearly to understand the tone. It was familiar, too familiar. The soft laughs, the shared moments, it was intimate. The kind of intimacy that I thought was reserved for me and Sarah. But now, it was being shared with someone else. The anger inside me simmered, but I held it in check. I couldn't act on it yet. I had to stay calm. I had to stay focused. My eyes remained closed, my body as still as possible, my breath shallow. Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboards, every word they spoke, was now amplified in my mind. I couldn't escape it. And then I heard something that made my heart race, a faint sound of footsteps. They were getting closer, slowly, deliberately. Each step seemed to echo through the quiet house, and with each passing second, I felt my nerves tighten even more. Was it Sarah? Was she coming into the bedroom? The door to the bedroom was still closed, but I could hear the soft rustle of fabric, the light shuffle of footsteps on the floor. I lay perfectly still, my body tense, not daring to make a sound. The moments felt like eternity. My mind was spinning, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat gathering at the back of my neck, my hands clenched in a fist beneath the covers. I couldn't tell if I was holding my breath because I was afraid of being caught, or because I was afraid of what would happen when the door opened. The footsteps paused, and then I heard it, the creak of the door. The sound was subtle, but in the silence of the room, it was impossible to miss. I froze, every muscle in my body on high alert. The door was opening. She was coming in. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading. The moment where everything I had suspected, feared, and questioned would finally come to the surface. My eyes were still closed, my body still, but my mind was racing. I could hear Sarah's quiet breathing on the other side of the door. She didn't know I was awake. She didn't know that I knew everything. The thought of confronting her, of finally breaking this facade, made my chest tighten with anticipation. Was she going to act like nothing had happened? Would she pretend I hadn't seen the truth? The door creaked open just a fraction. My heart thudded in my chest. She was here. She was so close, just a few feet away, and everything in me screamed to sit up, to demand the truth. But I didn't move. Not yet. I could hear her, her soft footsteps as she stepped inside. She was close now, so close. I could almost feel her presence, that warmth that used to be so comforting, but now felt distant, unfamiliar. Every part of me screamed for action, but I had to hold my ground. I couldn't let my emotions control me. I couldn't let her see that I knew. Not yet. The room was heavy with tension. Finally, I heard her whisper something, but the words were too low for me to catch. It wasn't loud enough for her to think I had heard, but just enough for me to feel the weight of it. Her voice, so soft, so guarded. Who was she speaking to? The question burned in my mind, but I didn't have the answers. Not yet. The door creaked again, but this time it was followed by the soft sound of footsteps retreating. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't coming all the way in. She had stepped back. Was Jason still here? Was she going to keep hiding this from me? Or was this her way of taking some distance before coming clean? The anger, the confusion, and the sense of betrayal surged inside me, but I held my ground. I couldn't act impulsively. I couldn't rush this confrontation. I had to be sure, and now I was certain. I had to face her. I had to hear her admit it. And when I finally did, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The silence was suffocating, but I knew it wouldn't last much longer. My heart pounded, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. I was ready to face the truth I had been avoiding for too long. The door opened slowly, almost deliberately, and I could hear Sarah's voice, low and whispering. Her words were muffled, too faint for me to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to someone else. Jason. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. My pulse raced. My heart hammered against my chest as I lay there in the darkness, barely breathing. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to get up, to demand answers, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen, to absorb every detail of what was happening right before me. Jason, the man I had trusted, the man I had always assumed was just a harmless coworker, was standing in my house. My mind reeled with disbelief. How had I missed this? How had I allowed this to happen, right under my nose, while I stayed blind to the truth? I could feel the anger rising within me, a slow burn that was beginning to consume me. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was the deception, the fact that Sarah had been living a double life, lying to me, hiding something so massive from me for who knows how long. I could barely keep the rage in check, but I knew I had to stay composed. I had to force myself to remain calm, to confront them with the truth, without losing control. I had been waiting for this moment for so long. I had listened to the whispers, the suspicions, the subtle clues. But now there was no more guessing. It was real. It was happening right in front of me, and I couldn't pretend anymore. The truth hit me full force, like a freight train slamming into my chest, and I knew I had to make them face me. I opened my eyes slowly, letting the reality of the situation settle over me like ice. The room was dim, shadows playing across the walls, and in the silence, I could hear Sarah's faint voice again. But this time I wasn't waiting. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't stay silent. With a sharp intake of breath, I sat up in bed. The bed creaked under my weight as I moved, the sound loud in the stillness of the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time in months, I felt alive despite the turmoil swirling inside me. The shock of the situation hit me full force. I had been lying to myself for so long, denying the truth, holding on to a marriage that had already been broken. But now, everything was clear. There was no more pretending. I had to face the truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The anger surged within me, the heat of it spreading like wildfire, but I fought to keep my voice steady, to keep control. The last thing I wanted was to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. No, I needed to make them understand that I knew. I looked directly at Sarah, my gaze sharp, my words cold as I spoke. "What the hell is going on, Sarah?" The words hung in the air, thick with anger and disbelief. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in shock, panic instantly sweeping across her face. Her body froze, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. The surprise on her face wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Fear of being caught, of being exposed. And then there was Jason. He just stood there. He didn't say a word. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't even look at me. His face was frozen, his body tense, but there was nothing. No defense, no attempt to justify his actions. He just stayed silent, like he was waiting for something. For me to explode? For me to break down? I could see the way he shifted uncomfortably, glancing towards Sarah, but never meeting my eyes. His body language screamed guilt, and in that moment I realized something. This wasn't the first time. This had been going on for far longer than I ever imagined. They weren't ashamed. They were just careful enough to hide it from me for this long. Sarah finally spoke, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper, but I could hear the desperation in it. "It's not what you think, I swear." I felt the words sting, like salt in an open wound. How many times had I heard that line? How many times had she used it to cover up the truth? But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Not after everything I had heard, everything I had seen. I couldn't be fooled again. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw everything." My voice was steady, even though inside I felt like I was being torn apart. "I know what you and Jason have been doing. I know you've been seeing him behind my back." Jason shifted again, his face flushing a deep shade of red, but still, he said nothing. He just stood there like he was waiting for the world to swallow him up. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I refused to let it control me. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I had to hold my ground because this was the moment everything changed. And Sarah? Her face was a mixture of fear and guilt now. She opened her mouth to speak, but there were no more excuses left. Her silence said it all. The truth was out, and there was no way to hide from it anymore. The words were out in the open, and there was no going back. I had finally gotten the answers I needed. But now, the real question was, what was I going to do about it? The silence in the room felt suffocating. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me. Jason's face went pale. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes darting everywhere except in my direction. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He knew. They both knew what was happening. They had been caught. I turned to Sarah, my mind spinning with 100 different thoughts, but I forced myself to focus. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading, the moment where the truth would finally be laid bare. My heart pounded in my chest, but my voice was ice cold as I demanded once more, "What's happening here, Sarah?" I could see her hesitation, the way she looked at Jason for a split second, almost like she was seeking his permission to speak. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Her eyes, once so full of warmth and affection, now betrayed the truth. There was guilt written all over her face. The kind of guilt you can't fake, the kind that lingers even in silence. And then the words came. She wasn't even trying to deny it. There were no more excuses, no more deflections. It wasn't the response I had expected, the words I had prepared myself to hear. It was raw, real. Jason opened his mouth, like he was about to say something. But before he could, Sarah spoke first. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, choked with emotion. I could see her trembling. She slowly sank to her knees, her eyes locked on the floor. Her apology felt hollow, empty. It wasn't the apology I was hoping for, not the one I needed. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, and those words hit me harder than anything else. They were laced with regret, but there was no real explanation, no justification for what had been going on. And just like that, everything I had been holding on to, everything I thought I knew, came crashing down. The weight of it hit me like a ton of bricks. My entire world, my entire life felt like it was collapsing around me. There was no denying it anymore. This was the truth. This was reality. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand more answers, but I couldn't. I was numb, the emotions swirling inside me. Anger, hurt, betrayal were so overwhelming, so intense, that I couldn't even process them. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was no going back. This moment, this single moment, had changed everything. Sarah, the woman I had built a life with, had shattered that life in a single, reckless decision. Jason, the man I had trusted, the man I had believed was my friend, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no way to undo this, no way to make it disappear. I looked at Sarah, still kneeling in front of me, tears streaming down her face, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. I was done. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about trust. The trust had been broken in the most brutal way possible, and there was no way to fix it. I didn't even know how to feel anymore. The pain had dulled, leaving behind an emptiness I didn't know how to fill. Jason still hadn't said a word. He stood there like a ghost, just watching, too terrified to speak, too ashamed to defend himself. But in that silence, I knew everything I needed to know. There was no defense. There were no words that could make this better. It was over. The room felt suffocating as I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was like I had just been punched in the gut, and now I was struggling to keep my footing. I could feel my hands shaking, the weight of everything pressing down on me, but I knew one thing for sure. This was the moment. This was the moment where everything changed. I looked at Sarah again, my eyes searching hers for something, anything that could explain this. But I found nothing. Her guilt, her regret, couldn't take back the pain she had caused. I knew the answer. The truth was right in front of me, and I had to accept it. And so I turned away. I didn't shout. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than any words could ever be. I walked out of that room and out of that house, knowing that I was leaving behind a woman I couldn't trust, a man who betrayed me, and a life that would never be the same again. The door closed behind me, and I felt the finality of it. There was no more pretending, no more questions, no more answers to seek. The truth had been revealed, and now it was up to me to walk away. Have you ever caught someone cheating? How did you find out? Drop your stories in the comments. Let's talk about it. And remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply walking away.